There are places that no longer exist on any map, yet they remain quietly alive in every breath of history. Their shapes have vanished, their coastlines erased, their ancient footprints long gone, yet they continue to act as a thin thread tying distant ages together. Beringia is one of those places, a vast landmass that once stretched between Siberia and Alaska, rising during the Ice Age and slipping away again when the sea returned. And yet, what it left behind was never truly erased from the memory of humankind. In that place, winds carrying the chill of Siberia swept across hard, dry earth that reached all the way to Alaska, creating an expanse so wide that even herds of mammoths moved like slow, wandering shadows beneath a pale silver sky. If someone were to stand at the Bering Strait today, they would see nothing but rough waves, low clouds, jagged rocky shores, and a sheet of freezing water. It is almost impossible to imagine that beneath those waters once lay an enormous world, a place where grasslands stretched out like a great hide, pulled tight beneath the wind, where ancient people set up their shelters, lit their fires, prepared for the long winters, and waited for the right moment to move into a new continent. When Beringia still existed, it was not a narrow bridge barely wide enough to cross. It was an unnamed country of its own, vast enough for many generations to live and die without ever reaching its edges. And it was within that vastness that history, archaeology, and genetics converged like three quiet streams flowing into one another. They tell us that the first people entering the Americas did not travel in a few years, or even a few generations. They moved over thousands of years, slowly, steadily, and transforming themselves along the way. Many generations lived their entire lives in Beringia, turning what was once just a stretch of exposed land into a true homeland. There, the climate was bitterly cold, yet patches of dry ground remained. There was enough game to hunt, plants to gather, and water to drink. And there, through isolation that lasted millennia, they became a distinct genetic population shaped by the land that held them. As the Ice Age slowly receded and the Earth warmed, the massive ice walls covering North America began to melt, and through a perfect coincidence of climate, wind, rain, and temperature, an ice-free corridor opened between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets. No one stood at the edge of that corridor and declared, "We will enter a new continent." There was no dramatic moment like that. There were only the smallest changes, a herd of caribou shifting direction, a valley holding a little less snow, a stretch of ground beginning to show beneath thawing ice. These quiet changes, repeated over many seasons, were enough for a group of people to realize that the world ahead was no longer blocked by a wall of ice. And so they walked. They moved southward toward a place where winters were shorter, where new grasses grew, where the great animals traveled. They did not know they were the first humans to step into a continent that would someday cradle hundreds of cultures. They only knew that movement was the way their ancestors had lived for tens of thousands of years. With every step they took, the wind behind them carried the cold breath of Beringia, and before them lay a land untouched by human footprints. Some groups followed the ice-free corridor, where bare ground stretched between two towering walls of white. Others traveled along the Pacific coast, perhaps using small boats or walking where land and melting ice sheets alternated. Those who chose the coast had an advantage. They hunted seals and fish, gathered seaweed, and moved faster because they did not have to navigate herds of massive animals or climb difficult terrain. That coastal route, supported by growing modern evidence, may have been the very first pathway that carried ancient people as far south as the shores of California and beyond. And then, on a day lost deep in prehistory, a group of travelers could no longer see any trace of Beringia behind them. They had gone too far. Behind them lay a land that would soon be swallowed by the rising sea. Ahead of them stretched a continent thousands of miles long. When they stepped into that new world, it opened before them like a blank page. They moved into Alaska, into the Yukon, then farther south into British Columbia, and eventually into what is now Washington, Oregon, and California. Others turned inward, toward wide grasslands, young river valleys freshly carved by glacial melt, and endless herds of great animals moving in groups of hundreds. No one said they were discovering a new continent. People of that time had no such concept. They lived by the rhythm of the land. But from our perspective today, looking back across millennia, every step they took feels like the opening notes of the grandest chapter in the history of the Americas. One of the things that makes this journey so extraordinary is the speed at which people spread across the land. Not fast in the modern sense, but fast in the way a hunter moves, steady, purposeful, and unhurried. Within just a few hundred years, their footprints appeared across what is now the western United States, and then across the vast plains. Even more astonishing are discoveries like Monte Verde in Chile, dated to more than 14,500 years ago, which show that some groups reached the far south of South America far earlier than anyone once imagined. This means they did not follow a single route, but many. They traveled through many paths, many generations, and many ways of living. The fossil footprints at White Sands, nearly 23,000 years old, push the story even deeper, showing that humans were present in the Americas at a time we never thought possible. These pieces of evidence force us to reimagine the journey. It was never a single, straight migration. It was not one band of travelers walking for years on end. It was more like a network of countless small movements, one group moving ahead, another following later, one hugging the coastline, another cutting inland, one staying in a place for many years, another never stopping for long. Each group left only faint traces in the earth, a few chipped stones, a thin layer of ash, a broken spear point, a shift in pollen where they opened a patch of forest. And when we connect these faint marks together, the map spreads out like ink, blooming on paper, soft, natural, flowing in directions no one could have predicted. The world they entered was nothing like Beringia. It was warmer, greener, and far more varied. From Alaska down to the Gulf of California, from the Great Plains to the Northeast woodlands, from mixed forests to burning deserts, every region was a challenge, a new lesson waiting to be learned. And it was these differences, repeated over thousands of years, that blossomed into countless distinct cultures, so many, in fact, that even modern researchers cannot fully categorize them all. And from the moment humans set foot on that continent, diversity began to ripple outward like waves from a stone dropped into still water. One group moved into the sweeping grasslands, where bison and pronghorn ran in herds that flowed like living rivers. Another group continued along the coastline, becoming people of the sea, reading currents, understanding the seasons of salmon, and recognizing the soft exhale of walruses drifting through the morning mist. Others slipped into forests so dense that sunlight could barely penetrate, and the deeper they went, the more they learned to live with birdsong, insect hum, and the quiet dangers of venomous snakes or large animals hidden in the undergrowth. Different rhythms of living led to different rhythms of thinking. People began to remember by telling, and to tell by remembering. Those who lived in the forests told stories in the language of rain and leaves. Those in the mountains told them through the sound of rolling stones. Those in the grasslands told them through the wind brushing over dry grass. Each environment shaped a style of storytelling, and from that style came symbols, and from those symbols came mythology. In the beginning, these myths were simply explanations for the world. Why winter arrives, why storms break, why certain animals appear and then vanish. But over time, they became the foundation for how people understood themselves. Meanwhile, the new land was not just something to pass through, it became a place where they stayed longer and longer. When a summer hunting camp became a winter camp and then became a place they returned to year after year, humans left more traces behind. The old ash piles grew thicker, temporary shelters were reinforced with sturdier wooden posts, paths between shrubs were worn into small trails, and from these trails, archaeologists today trace the past the way one reads faint veins on a piece of ancient stone. What makes this process feel so vivid is how delicately nature itself preserves memory. Soil disturbed when people dug for roots becomes a signature in the sediment. Changes in pollen ratios in lake beds tell modern scientists when a community expanded its living space. Even layers of volcanic ash sometimes captured the tiny footprints of children walking beside the larger prints of adults, small, fleeting moments that somehow make the distant past feel close enough to touch. And as people lived long enough in one place, they began to form social structure. At first, it was only a simple division of tasks: who hunted, who gathered, who built the fires, who cared for the children. But with time, that soft structure became a subtle system. No one imposed it, yet everyone knew their role. The elders became the living memory of the community. They remembered where the waters rose in years of heavy rain, where animals appeared when the seasons shifted, which plants healed wounds best, and which roots needed long cooking before they were safe to eat. They had no titles, no absolute authority, but they carried the weight of seasons long gone. It was during this period that the earliest rituals emerged. Rituals were not only acts of gratitude toward the natural world, they were a way to keep the community in rhythm. One ritual marked the moment to plant seeds, another opened the hunting season, another guided how food should be shared after the salmon run. Rituals aligned everyone in time. And as more families lived closer to one another, rituals became a gentle way to avoid conflict, not because someone enforced rules, but because everyone agreed that certain moments belonged to the whole community. Sometimes a ritual was nothing more than an evening of storytelling around the fire. Elders told of ancestors who crossed frozen lands, describing hardships they no longer remembered with their eyes, but with their imagination. These stories did more than teach children where they came from. They taught them how to read the natural world. Every story carried a lesson. Read the clouds to predict rain. Read the soil to sense the season. Read the animals to understand migration. Over generations, this oral knowledge became the very foundation of their culture, and slowly people began lifting their gaze to the sky. Once they stayed long enough in one place, they noticed that the sun did not rise at the same point every day. Its rising and setting shifted with the seasons, creating a rhythm so steady that just a few years of observation were enough to predict the moments essential for planting and harvesting. The sky, once just the backdrop of the world, became the calendar of the world. The first stone or wooden posts were not raised to mark graves, but to track shadows. When a shadow grew longer or shorter, people understood where the season was moving. When the sun rose perfectly between two familiar hills, they knew summer had arrived. These seemingly simple observations became the basis of indigenous astronomy, something that would later flourish in cultures such as the Maya or the Inca, but whose roots lay thousands of years earlier within small communities just beginning to farm and settle. Alongside the sun, the stars became marks etched across the night's dark stone. People of the plains noticed that when a certain constellation touched the horizon, the herds would begin to move. People of the rainforests learned that the angle of the Milky Way foretold whether the rainy season would come early or late. The Andean peoples would one day read mountain shadows and moonlight to predict the weather, but even in these early eras, communities had already begun to understand that the sky was never still. It had its own rhythm, and if listened to carefully, humans could live in harmony with it. As people learned to read the land and the sky, they developed a sense of belonging. No longer moving constantly to escape winter or follow great herds, they began to stay and build memory. Every memory left a mark on the ground, and every mark on the ground became part of a shared story. That was when the first identities formed, not national identities as we think of today, but a quiet understanding that we belong to this place, that our lives have rhythm, season, and cycle, all intertwined with one another. From these quiet shifts, the Americas grew into a continent of hundreds of cultures. There was no single center, no early empire forcing others to follow, no first civilization shaping the rest. Every community was its own center, developing, adapting, and remembering in its own way. And it was precisely this scattered yet interconnected tapestry that made the Americas a vast woven cloth, where every thread was a story, yet the entire fabric shared one background color, the color of adaptation, of movement, and of the enduring human ability to survive every change nature placed before them. The flourishing of diverse communities across the continent did not unfold in a straight line. It spread like concentric circles, each ring marking a stage in which people discovered more about their environment and about themselves. When a group remained in one place long enough, they didn't just learn the land horizontally. When the grass grew best, when the rivers ran low, they learned it vertically. They knew which layers of soil held water longest, which ones rotted roots, which ones showed signs that large animals had once sheltered there. This understanding laid the foundation for early cultivation, and gradually those small groups became true settled communities. Places like the valleys of Mexico, the slopes of the Andes, and the riverbanks of the northeastern woodlands began drawing people back season after season, and when they returned long enough, they started experimenting with the plants that grew around their camps. Agriculture did not erupt in a single season. It was a chain of small, patient experiments stretched across thousands of years. One person noticed which grasses produced larger seeds. Another realized that plants growing near camp tasted sweeter than those growing farther away. Someone else observed that when fruit cores were tossed into the refuse heap, new sprouts emerged after the rain. These tiny observations, gathered quietly over countless generations, eventually led to the birth of agriculture. In Mexico, the small, hard, thick-shelled teosinte slowly transformed into maize after hundreds of generations of human selection. No one looking at the first plant could have imagined it would someday feed entire civilizations. But by choosing the cobs that were larger, softer, and easier to grind, people were unknowingly guiding the evolution of a plant that would become the heart of a continent. In the Andes, a similar process unfolded with the potato. From hundreds of wild tubers, people favored those that tolerated cold, provided more energy, and carried no toxins, until one day the potato became the foundation for communities living at altitudes where no other crop on Earth could survive. In the Amazon rainforest, where the soil is poor and sunlight filters down through only a few layers of canopy, people learned to plant in mixtures, to plant in patches of light, and to plant in cycles of small, controlled burns. And they created what modern researchers now call terra preta, black earth, rich in organic matter, rich in charcoal, capable of holding nutrients far better than ordinary soil. It stands as proof that indigenous agriculture was not limited to open, fertile landscapes. Even in the most challenging environments, humans found ways to work with the land and make it flourish. But agriculture alone does not create culture. What creates culture is the memory of agriculture. Once people began depending on the seasons, they needed to know exactly when to plant, when to harvest, and when to rest the soil. That need drew their attention back to the sky. The sky became the clock, the sun became the calendar, and the moon became the rhythm. Each year they watched where the sun rose, where the midday light fell, and how long the shadows stretched. When they set a stone pillar to track a shadow, they did not realize they were laying the first brick of an astronomical tradition. They were simply trying to remember time. Winter solstice and summer solstice became sacred markers because these were the moments when nature offered its clearest signals. When the sun rose perfectly between two familiar hills, the season for planting began. When shadows reached their shortest length, the heat had reached its peak. And when the sun set at its farthest point in the south, the cold season was on its way back. Communities across the continent began tying their rituals to these celestial moments. Rituals became the only reliable way to pass memories across dozens of generations in a world without writing. During this same period, networks of exchange began to form. There was no currency, no merchants in the modern sense, but paths emerged, foot trails, river routes, coastal passages. People from Wyoming carried black obsidian into the plains. People from the Great Lakes brought natural copper southward. Coastal communities traded bright shells and ornaments up into the mountains. No one built roads, yet roads formed naturally through centuries of seasonal movement. These exchange routes accelerated the flow of ideas. A new hunting technique developed in the forests could reach the prairies within a few generations. A decorative style, born in a coastal village, might appear thousands of miles inland without any major migration at all. And this flow gave the Americas a cultural network that was soft, decentralized, yet deeply connected through its own rhythm, the rhythm of seasonal sharing. However, as cultures grew more settled, the past stopped being something simply remembered and began to be something interpreted. People started asking, where do we come from? Not in a geographical sense, but in a spiritual one. They remembered the old lands, the long journey, the seasons when ice forced their ancestors to leave home, and gradually those memories transformed into mythology. Myth was not their way of escaping truth. It was their way of expressing truth in a form that matched the soul. To them, the origin of humankind was not a physical event, but a spiritual one, where earth, wind, fire, and water met to bring life into being. In the American Southwest, many communities tell that their ancestors emerged from the earth and walked northward, a symbolic way of describing the seasonal migrations between highlands and lowlands. In the Andes, people believe their ancestors stepped out from a crack in the mountains, and when we look at the geography of the Andes, it makes sense. That crack could easily be the mark left behind when ancient glaciers melted and opened new passageways. In the Amazon, ancestors are said to have appeared from the depths of the forest, where darkness and light weaved together, a reflection of a life lived under deep shade, surviving on the faint sunlight filtering through layers of canopy. All of these stories are ways people stay connected to the land. To them, the land does more than sustain life. It holds the memory of their ancestors. When they touch a stone, they are not just touching matter, they are touching history. When they look at a river, they are not just looking at water, they see the path their ancestors may have taken. And through this combination of land, sky, and memory, the cultures of the Americas form a vast tapestry, soft yet powerful, diverse yet unified at the deepest level. But to understand this depth fully, we have to look back to Beringia, the lost land that still lives quietly within every culture of the Americas. Beringia was not just a place people passed through, it was a place where they lived, waited, and transformed themselves over thousands of years. It was where they learned to survive the cold, where they sharpened their ability to read nature, where they built the skills needed to adapt to a changing world. And when they finally left that land, now swallowed by the sea, these skills became the tools that allowed them to thrive across an entire continent. And when Beringia disappeared, the thread connecting the two continents vanished with it. There was no turning back. People could only move forward, not as a heroic march, but as a natural rhythm of life. Each generation traveled a little farther, each season added a new memory, and over thousands of years those memories became the history of an entire hemisphere. As people ventured deeper into the new continent, they slowly became reflections of the lands they lived in. Where the earth was wide and flat, they became people of wind and grass. Where the forests were humid and sunlight slipped through only in thin shards, they became people who could hear the breathing of the trees. Where mountains rose steep and the air thinned, they learned to live with altitude and understood that even the sky could feel close enough to touch. These transformations did not happen once. They repeated with every season, every generation, every long cycle of climate. Over thousands of years, each culture in the Americas carried its own symphony, not a symphony of power, but of adaptation. One of the forces that turned this adaptation into culture was the stability of collective memory. Once people lived in a place long enough, they began to remember the land by naming it. They named streams, mountain ridges, and valleys, but those names were never just labels. They were stories. A river was never simply a river. It might be the place where ancestors met their enemies, where they survived a drought, or where the salmon returned in a year when everyone feared winter would never end. When a name carried a story, the landscape became a living memory, and each generation needed only to hear the name to recall the history tied to that place. This is why so many indigenous cultures have naming systems so complex that outsiders could never fully understand them. A single mountain might have 5 names, one for each season, or for different faces of the mountain: the slope where the snow melts early, the ridge where the winds swell, the peak where the sun sets perfectly on the longest day of the year. Geography for them was not a static map, but a living body, with breath, temperament, and memory. And this way of seeing ensured that indigenous communities never thought of themselves as owning the land. They saw themselves as part of it. The connection between land and people also showed itself in the pathways they traveled. Unlike civilizations that depended on writing, maps, or fortifications, indigenous peoples relied on memory and natural signs. These invisible trails existed for thousands of years before they became actual trade routes. They followed features that only someone who had walked the land for generations could detect: a mountain range running parallel to the coast, a broad valley free of predators, or a cold seasonal wind marking the safest direction to travel. In many cases, it was the large animals themselves who became the first architects of these early routes. As bison moved seasonally, they pounded wide trails into the ground, paths a meter across or more. People watched and followed because wherever the animals went, there was water, grass, and shelter. This created vast networks of movement across the continent long before humans established permanent settlements. When people learned to use boats, the coasts and rivers became new highways. One group in the West traveled thousands of miles along the Pacific shoreline in wooden vessels, learning to read waves, tides, and the shifting veils of fog. Others traveled deep into the interior by canoe, using rivers as open highways that carried stone, hides, pottery, and stories farther than any footpath of the time could ever allow. And it was through these encounters that the Americas built an exchange network not based on power, but on trust. This trust was not blind. It was born from centuries of meeting one another seasonally, during the salmon runs, during bison hunts, during the fall chestnut harvest, during the rainy seasons when certain regions became unreachable. Each season created natural meeting grounds, and those places became cultural crossroads where groups traded goods, technologies, stories, rituals, and even marriage partners. This exchange reached far beyond physical objects. It extended into symbols. A decorative pattern emerging along the coast could appear among communities on the plains generations later. A style of pottery created near a great river might show up in forest villages miles away. These symbols did not move in straight, predictable lines. They flowed through human movement, through brief encounters that left lasting impressions. But beneath all of this exchange was a deeper foundation, the enduring relationship between people and the environment. Living within nature rather than apart from it, people learned to read signals so subtle that the modern world barely notices them. Heavy morning fog meant the salmon would return late. Winds blowing from the mountains signaled an early rainy season. The cawing of crows in large clusters predicted snowfall within days. Every sight and sound became a sentence in the book of nature, one that only those who lived long with the land could truly read. From this ability to read the natural world, many communities began to understand that the environment was not fixed. Climates shifted, forests expanded and retreated, rivers changed course, and grasslands gave way to young woods after seasons of heavy rain. These changes forced people to adapt constantly. A place that was once ideal for hunting might become dense forest within a few generations. A winter refuge could be swept away by floods, but these changes did not destroy communities. They made them more flexible, more inventive, and more connected to one another. And sometimes those changes left marks so powerful that even thousands of years later we can still see them in the sediment layers. Massive floods deposited thick beds of mud mixed with rotted wood. Widespread forest fires left behind dark layers of charcoal that modern archaeologists can measure through radioisotope dating. Prolonged droughts cracked the earth and created sediment signatures that reveal entire climate phases, periods when people had no choice but to adapt or move. Each layer of soil is like a page in a book that time recorded accidentally, and archaeology is simply the process of reading those pages backward to glimpse the lives of our ancestors. In certain regions, the climate shifted so abruptly that communities were forced to transform entirely. In the southwest, there were centuries-long stretches with so little rain that many villages had to abandon their homes. Yet what astonishes us is that they did not disappear. They moved, carrying with them their pottery styles, their symbols, their social structures, and rebuilt new communities in different landscapes. This created cultural layers stacked upon one another, so that today, when scientists excavate a single site, they sometimes uncover traces of many different generations, each one holding its own quiet but meaningful story of migration. It was this flexibility that allowed people on the continent not only to survive but to thrive. They did not build stone walls for defense, they used nature as their ally. There was no single civilization that dominated the rest because each culture adapted in its own direction. And it was exactly this diversity in ways of living, ways of knowing, ways of breathing with the land, that made the Americas one of the richest cultural landscapes on Earth long before the modern world ever arrived. But to understand the full scale of that adaptability, we must return to where everything began, Beringia. Not as a lost land, but as the first stage of a long human experiment, one that tested how many different environments people could learn to live in. Beringia was the first lesson, the place where humans learned to listen to climate, to read animal tracks, to live with ice and wind. When they left it behind, they carried no monuments or written records, they carried experience. That experience became the tool that opened hundreds of new pathways across the Americas, until one day, when they stood at the edge of the sea and looked toward the far shore, they no longer saw the place they had come from. They saw only a wide, waiting land where new memories were ready to take root. As the memory of Beringia faded deeper into the past and people spread across the continent, the first distinct cultures began to take shape. Every landscape became its own world, and humans, almost instinctively, learned to merge with that world the way a small stream blends into a great river. At that time, the differences between groups did not create division, they created abundance. The farther people traveled from Beringia, the more they reinterpreted its memory, some recalling it as the homeland of their ancestors, others seeing it as the first doorway through which their people stepped into life on this vast continent. In the north, communities living near the Arctic developed an ability to read wind, ice, and sea with a precision almost unimaginable today. They knew when the ice was thick enough to cross, when cracks would form, when walruses would surface to breathe, and when the caribou would begin their migration. Every movement in nature was a signal, and they read those signals the way someone reads every line in a well-known book. In a world of cold and risk, knowledge was life. A single mistake could mean death, so the memory of past seasons was passed down with deep reverence. When they told stories of their ancestors, they did not speak only of feats or hunts. They spoke of how their elders read blizzards, how they sensed the shift of wind, how they looked at a glow on the horizon and understood the condition of the sea beneath their feet. Across the sweeping plains where the horizon opened like the edge of an enormous world, people developed a way of life tied to movement and openness. The bison herds were the center of the universe here, and their arrival or disappearance determined the rhythm of entire communities. People did not domesticate the bison, they domesticated themselves to the animal's migrations. A culture of movement emerged, tents that could be raised in an hour and taken down in minutes, belongings kept light for travel, memories etched not into stone but into stories, rituals, and subtle signs that outsiders rarely recognized. Along the Pacific coast, communities developed an early mastery of woodworking because wood was the most precious resource of that land. They knew which trees made the best boats, which made the strongest houseposts, which should be carved into figures of meaning. In their hands, wood was not just a material, it was the memory of the forest. The grain of the wood was read like the age lines of a life lived long, and a skilled carver needed to read the story of the tree before shaping it. When their boats glided over the waves, they carried not only people, but also a deep understanding of the sea, its swirling currents, shifting winds, the sound of stones beneath the water, and the morning colors of the fog. To them, the ocean was not emptiness, it was a pathway. In the northeast, where great rivers weave together like green veins across the body of the continent, people developed ceremonial centers and massive earthworks. These mounds were not just constructions, they were ways of speaking to the sky. Some were aligned perfectly with the sunrise of the winter solstice. Others were shaped like serpents, birds, or spirals, reflecting a deep understanding of natural cycles. What is remarkable is how early these structures appeared, long before agriculture became widespread in the region. This reveals that humans had a spiritual need to connect with the land long before they felt the need for stable production. That connection was instinctive. Meanwhile, in the forests of the southeast, an entirely different world blossomed. This region had mild winters, humid summers, and thick vegetation. People learned to live with the forest not by clearing it entirely, but by creating small openings where crops could be grown in cycles. They understood that the forest could heal itself, and that land allowed to rest would become even more fertile. Agriculture here was not a battle against nature, but a partnership. Through this approach, they developed a rotational farming system so effective that thousands of years later, many forested areas still maintain rich soil thanks to the subtle stewardship of ancient communities. In this same region, exchange networks grew remarkably strong. A carved wooden seat or a necklace made of shell beads could travel hundreds of miles from where it was created. Yet these objects were not luxury goods. They carried symbolic meaning. They might represent alliances between groups, milestones of adulthood, or the shared memory of a community that had endured a difficult season and survived. Because they were tied to collective memory, these items were passed down through generations as living treasures. Far to the southwest, where desert meets plateau, communities developed a unique architectural mastery using stone and wood. Their homes were built in clusters, clinging to cliff faces or stretching across valleys. Each dwelling was part of a larger structure, much like each person was part of the community. Ceremonial circles, underground chambers, and solar or stellar observatories were constructed with astonishing precision. No one knows the names of the builders because the structures did not belong to individuals. They were the physical memory of the community, built to hold time itself. In this same region, understanding water became the center of culture. In a land with so little rain, people learned to read clouds from great distances, to read the wind to predict storms, and to read the stones to find underground springs. They dug canals, built reservoirs, and created small, terraced fields to catch every drop of rain. These works were not grand, but they were so refined that modern researchers are still amazed by them. This shows that the environment did not weaken people, it pushed them to become more inventive. Looking farther south, Mesoamerica developed large cultural centers much earlier than many other regions. But what made these centers remarkable was not their size, it was the way they were positioned on the land. Every structure was aligned with the movements of the sun and moon. Wide plazas were not built for warfare, but for ceremony, for gathering, for reading time through the patterns of light falling onto stone. When the sun reached a precise point, they knew planting season had begun or the rains were about to arrive. Astronomy was not a separate science. It was the system that kept entire communities alive. Farther still, the Andes elevated adaptation to an entirely new level. Towering mountains, harsh climates, and rugged terrain made this region one of the greatest challenges humans had ever faced. Yet instead of abandoning these difficult lands, people wove themselves into them. Terraced fields appeared, shelves of fertile soil carved into steep mountainsides. In thin air and cold winds, they experimented with hundreds of varieties of potatoes and native grains. Each type was planted at a specific altitude, creating a finely layered agricultural system. This creativity not only ensured survival, but formed a natural economic model. Each village produced what suited its elevation and exchanged goods with others according to the seasons. It was in the Andes that people elevated the art of reading the natural world into a profound cultural practice. They watched the movements of stars, the phases of the moon, the shadows cast by mountains, the wind funneling through narrow passes. These observations became rituals, and rituals became bridges linking past to future. Nature was not something to look at, it was a teacher to study. Across the Americas, one thing becomes strikingly clear. Despite living in environments so extreme and varied, communities shared a common philosophy, a philosophy of balance. No one sought to dominate nature completely. No one built an empire that stretched across the continent. There were no unified written laws, yet there existed unwritten laws grounded in cycles, respect, and memory. And this philosophy, though rarely named, was the foundation that allowed the continent to flourish for thousands of years before the outside world arrived. At its deepest level, that philosophy traces back to Beringia, the place where the ancestors learned that to live is to adapt, to observe, to preserve each season, to understand that the earth is always changing and that humans survive only when they are willing to change with it. As indigenous cultures across the continent settled more deeply into their homelands, people began to understand that their existence was not an act of domination, but the result of a long conversation between humans and nature. Each generation experienced the land differently. Some grew up during long seasons of rain and believed water was an endless blessing. Others endured relentless droughts and viewed every drop as a sign of mercy from the sky. Still others watched the great animals disappear and came of age wondering why migration routes shifted or why species vanished. How could they not be shaped by change, when the very world that raised them changed every day? This is why memory became the foundation of every culture. Without writing to record history or preserve complex instructions, collective memory was the only book they had. But memory did not live only in stories. It lived in rituals, in symbols, in the way elders looked at the sky to read the seasons, in the way hunters read the ground. A patch of grass thicker than usual might signal the bison would shift their path. Birds appearing early might warn that winter was approaching faster than expected. A deep crack in the soil might recall a drought year that ancestors had once cautioned about. In the northeast, people told stories of ancient floods so old that modern archaeologists can still find their traces in the earth. A great mound might be built to remember the year when the waters rose higher than ever before, sweeping away entire villages. A ritual might emerge from the memory of a winter so long that food nearly ran out. These stories, retold through generations, became the living history of the community. On the plains, memory lived in the paths of the bison. Elders knew exactly which valleys the herds would cross, and even which month or year a great herd would appear. When bison vanished from an area, the grief was not only for the loss of food, it was for the loss of a memory. For them, bison were not merely animals, they were seasons, rhythms, calendars. Among coastal communities, memory lived in the tides. When the tide rose unusually high, when salmon arrived late, when waves changed their sound at night, people knew something in the ocean was shifting. Sometimes these changes forced entire adjustments in daily life, moving the camp, finding new fishing grounds, or changing the timing of sea journeys. Each small adjustment became a lesson, and that lesson was preserved for years, in stories, in songs, in patterns carved into wood. In the deserts of the southwest, memory lived in stone. People studied the cracks in rocks to understand rainfall from years past. They carved symbols into stone to mark the seasons of wind, rain, and harvest. Some of these petroglyphs still remain clear today, revealing how ancient communities tracked time by observing mountain shadows and the sun slipping across narrow rock crevices. These markings were not meaningless art, they were tools for preserving knowledge for the future. And then, as cultures settled into their own rhythms, the rise of agriculture in many places reshaped entire social structures. No longer constantly on the move, many groups began living together for long periods, forming true villages. But what is fascinating is that agriculture did not turn the Americas into a mirror of other continents. There were no early empires, no towering stone fortresses, no absolute centers of power. Each region developed its own path. Some raised mounds, some built round houses, some shaped terraced fields, some created small canal systems, others practiced cyclical forest clearing. In the Amazon, agriculture did not clear vast forests. Instead, people opened small patches, worked them for a few years, then moved on in cycles. Each plot was allowed to recover, creating a rotational farming system perfectly suited to the multi-layered ecosystem. This kept the forest from being exhausted. In fact, many parts of the Amazon today are considered ancient secondary forests, land touched repeatedly by humans, yet shaped in a way that nurtured, rather than destroyed, the environment. In the southeast, maize, beans and squash developed early, allowing populations to grow quickly. Although large villages appeared, they did not become expanding kingdoms. Instead, they formed wide networks of exchange built on trust. Places such as the Mississippi region later became major ceremonial centers where enormous earth mounds were raised, not through political pressure, but through the shared belief that ceremonies could connect the community with the sky and the earth. In Mesoamerica, environmental conditions and dense populations pushed the early development of more complex centers. But what made these centers special was not authority, it was their philosophy of time. Every structure was tied to a calendar, every ritual followed the cycles of the sun. Great plazas were not designed for displays of power, but for reading time, time to plant, time to harvest, time for the rains to return. In the Andes, potato and quinoa agriculture required a profound understanding of soil and altitude. This created a vertically layered economy unlike anything else in the world. Each altitude supported a different crop, and each crop supported another. Communities exchanged goods up and down the mountains, forming a natural system that needed no coercion. The harsh environment forced people here to cooperate more closely, share more freely, and depend on one another in deeply structured ways. Across the entire continent, one thing becomes clear. Every social system revolved around a single axis: cycles. Cycles of seasons, cycles of rivers, cycles of wind, cycles of sunlight, cycles of vast climate patterns invisible to the eye, but deeply felt in collective memory. These cycles were woven into every ritual, every story, every structure, every form of social organization. And these cycles shaped the deepest identity of the Americas long before the great civilizations of later eras emerged. What is strange and beautiful is that despite living in such different places, indigenous peoples shared a common philosophy. Humans do not stand above nature, they stand within it. They did not see themselves as owners of the land. They saw themselves as temporary stewards, as rememberers, as links in a chain. And this philosophy was not naive peace, but a clear understanding that everything in the world has its place, its moment, and humans must know when to act, when to step back, and when to listen. Seen from the present, it is easy to forget that this philosophy traces back to the first lessons their ancestors learned in Beringia, a place where ice, wind, and earth taught them that living was not about conquest, but about reading the smallest signals in a constantly shifting world, where brutal winters made sharing a matter of survival, where long periods of isolation taught them to rely on one another, to trust each other, and to pass down knowledge as softly as water flowing over stone. This is why, even after tens of thousands of years, the imprint of Beringia still lingers in the consciousness of every culture across the Americas, not as a geographic memory, but as a spiritual beginning, a foundational lesson, a quiet pause in history that shaped how people saw the world. And from that quiet beginning, the Americas moved into more complex eras when agriculture expanded, populations grew, and the first major cultural centers emerged. Yet even as they stepped into these new periods of development, the core values of their ancestors remained unchanged, undiminished, simply woven more deeply into their ways of living, into their rituals, into the rhythms of every culture. As indigenous communities became firmly rooted across the continent, something subtle happened. Memory stopped recording only seasons, rituals, or migration paths of animals. It began to record the long shifts in climate. These shifts did not happen within a single lifetime, nor within 2 or 3 generations. They stretched across hundreds of years, slow enough that those living through them barely noticed, yet long enough to transform entire landscapes. And because people lived within that change, they became silent witnesses to climatic swings that modern science is only now reconstructing through tree rings, lake sediments, and ice cores. There were periods when forests expanded, rivers widened, and rains arrived earlier. During these times, populations grew, villages spread, and agriculture flourished. But there were also long stretches when drought settled in, lasting decades, drying the land, shrinking water sources, and pushing animals farther and farther away. And it was in these harsh moments that flexibility, an inheritance from the days of Beringia, became the anchor that kept communities from breaking apart. In the southwest, where stone villages and terraced fields once thrived, long droughts forced communities to leave places they had lived in for centuries. Their departure was not loud. There were no wars, no destruction, only the slow fading of the land. And when the land could no longer sustain them, they gathered everything they could carry, the best seeds, the most important pottery, the memories of their ancestors, and the growing techniques that had saved them through difficult seasons. They left their homes behind, but carried the soul of their community with them. In Mesoamerica, climate shifts had equally profound effects. There were periods of heavy rainfall that enriched the soil, strengthened maize agriculture, and fueled population growth. But there were also times when the rains failed, the earth cracked, and the forests retreated. Large groups had no choice but to split and move into new regions. These waves of dispersal made the cultural fabric of the region more diverse and more intricate, yet still held together by shared threads of ritual, astronomy, art, and communal ceremony. In the Andes, long climate cycles altered the snow lines of the mountains. When the snow melted heavily, water was abundant and agriculture expanded. When the snow thickened and water grew scarce, people shifted planting seasons, changed crops, and sometimes moved entire villages to different slopes. These adjustments did not break communities. They made them more skilled, more resilient, like tough cords gripping stone in mountain wind. During these long periods of environmental change, ritual life reached remarkable sophistication. When nature became unpredictable, people leaned on memory and the signals of the sky, and ritual became the frame that kept the community in rhythm. Rain ceremonies, earth thanksgiving rites, harvest festivals. These were not merely spiritual symbols, they were reminders that life moves in cycles, that difficult times will end, that seasons will return. Repeated year after year, these rituals made every person feel they were not living alone in time but were part of a long current flowing from ancestors thousands of years before. On the plains, when bison disappeared for a time because of climate shifts or long winters, communities turned to smaller animals, fished the great rivers, or expanded their hunting grounds. But they never believed the bison were gone. They believed the bison were following a cycle, and that cycle would return. This was not blind faith. It was built on thousands of years of observation. Large animals moved on rhythms deeper than human ones, rhythms remembered through ceremony, not writing. Along the Pacific coast, changes in ocean currents caused salmon to arrive early in some years, late in others, sometimes in such abundance that people built massive drying racks, and sometimes so few that communities relied on other sources. Yet through all of this, they remained stable because they never placed all their hope in a single food source. Their diverse ways of living made them one of the longest-standing maritime cultures on Earth. Viewed as a whole, climate change did not weaken the Americas. It turned the continent into a vast laboratory for human adaptability. There was no central authority issuing commands. Instead, each community faced its environment with its own experience, shaping its own strategies. And when we place those strategies side by side, we see a breathtaking mosaic. People who read stars, people who read forests, people who read ice, people who read wind, people who read water, all walking a path first opened by their ancestors in Beringia, the path of flexibility. But not all changes came from nature. There were times when large communities emerged and gentle forms of social hierarchy took shape, not built on absolute power, as in many other continents, but on knowledge and responsibility. In many places, those who kept the rituals were respected not because they ruled, but because they preserved the memory of the sky. Elsewhere, those skilled in shaping stone or pottery held honored roles because no one else could do what they did. In regions where people traveled far by boat, those who understood the ocean were the soul of the community. And in deep forest regions, the person who could read animal tracks was the one who protected the survival of the entire group. These central roles did not create rigid classes, they created social flexibility. Anyone could become a ceremony leader if they learned the rituals. Anyone could become a sky reader if they observed long enough and deeply enough. Knowledge was open to anyone with the patience and respect required. This gave the community a sense that it could always rebuild itself if a role was lost, not dependent on individuals, but anchored in shared memory. In many regions, this gentle stratification led to large cultural centers, cool, quiet, yet mysteriously beautiful, where people did not live densely but gathered only during ritual seasons. There, sun festivals, rain festivals, and seasonal rites formed the spiritual center of life. People from many villages, even distant groups, came to these places not because they were forced, but because they believed the ceremonies kept the rhythm of the entire region steady. These centers were not cities in the modern sense, they were the rhythmic hearts of their territories. And it was in these gatherings that stories of the ancestors continued to be told. Not the recent ancestors, but the distant ones, the ones who crossed the frozen lands where the sun hung low and the winds were sharp, the ones who followed the great animals across icy plains, the ones who first stepped into the new continent when the ice corridor opened. Storytellers did not mention Beringia as a scientific term. They spoke of it as a distant world, a world of ice, wind, resolve, and patience, qualities every indigenous person understood as the essence of existence. And in listening to those stories, the young understood that they were not living alone in their land. They were the final link in a line that stretched across thousands of seasons. A line that began on a land now buried beneath the sea, traveled through ice, forests, rivers, mountains, and deserts, and arrived at their feet. They realized that every season they lived, every ritual they performed, every seed they planted was part of a larger story. And that story, when seen clearly, was not only a history of migration, it was a history of adaptation, a history that still carried the breath of Beringia in every beat. As the stories of distant ancestors continued to be told in evening gatherings beneath the night sky, something else quietly unfolded in the lives of the communities scattered across this vast continent. They began to sense time in a deeper way, not just the time of seasons or years, but the time of long cycles, changes no single generation could ever witness from beginning to end. And in recognizing this, people began building structures to record what their eyes alone could not follow throughout a lifetime. In the northeast and the Ohio Valley, enormous earthworks were shaped with astonishing precision. These circular constructions aligned with the path of the moon across its 18.6-year cycle, a cycle longer than the average human lifespan at the time. This means that many generations had to observe, remember, and pass down their findings to complete a single structure. No one knows the name of the first person who began measuring lunar shadows, or the last person who placed the final layer of soil. Yet the earthworks remain, standing as quiet witnesses to humanity's enduring patience before the sky. In Mesoamerica, observation went even further. Not only the sun and moon, but also the cycle of Venus was tracked. Venus, the brightest planet in the night sky, disappears and reappears according to a pattern that only the most patient observers would ever notice. And they did notice. They inscribed that cycle into their architecture, their rituals, and the spiritual maps of their world. When a planet becomes part of ritual, it tells us something profound. People were no longer looking at the sky simply to predict seasons, but to understand their own place within the vastness of the cosmos. In the Andes, sky watching was intertwined with watching the mountains. On certain days of the year, the sun rose precisely within a particular notch between peaks, or its light touched a specific stone. These became markers of time, and each marker became the basis for a ritual tied to the community's survival. At altitudes over 3,000 meters, the sky felt close enough for light to become a natural instrument, one unavailable to people living in the lowlands. From this intimacy, they developed a unique and deeply subtle astronomical system, one that few people today even know existed. Elsewhere, understanding the seasons did not come from watching the sky at all, but from observing animals. In the Amazon, where dense canopy often hid the heavens, people read the sound of insects, the appearance of particular birds, or the color of decaying leaves on the forest floor to tell when a season was shifting. Every forest acted as a clock, but a clock without hands. It told time only through the earth's whispers and the murmur of wind. Those who lived their whole lives under the canopy understood it as well as they understood their own hands. During this same period, people began developing art as a way to express what stories alone could not fully capture. In the Pacific Northwest, towering wooden poles were carved with intricate figures of birds, fish, bears, and wolves. These forms were not merely religious symbols, they were maps of an entire worldview. They told of ancestors, of the relationship between people and the natural world, of the rightful order of beings within the universe. Each carved figure held a compact story, and only those within the community could understand every layer of meaning. In the Southwest, pottery became a way to record the memory of the land itself. Every spiral, every circle, every zigzag line carried its own meaning: a winding river, a summer storm, a lightning strike, the path of the ancestors. And when a pot shattered, anyone who picked up a fragment centuries later could still understand something about the mind of the person who shaped it, something rare for any culture without written language. In the Andes, textile art reached a level of absolute refinement. Every pattern woven into fabric was not merely decoration, it was a means of communication, lineage, standing within the community, the story of one's group, even simplified maps that preserved key roots. A garment was not just clothing, it was a piece of identity. When someone finished weaving a large textile, they were weaving their memories into it. Across the continent, the art of indigenous peoples was never pure art in the modern sense. It was a medium for speaking with the sky, with the earth, with the ancestors, and with the future. It was a second language, the language of symbols. And because symbols never die, they cross time in ways that spoken words cannot. Although each region developed its own artistic traditions, all cultures converged on one profound idea: the connection between the visible world and the invisible one. Indigenous peoples did not see the universe as split into two separate realms. Instead, they believed everything — earth, sky, people, animals, water, wind — was bound together by threads of unseen relationship. Every ritual was a way to keep those threads alive. Every season was a chance to restore balance. Every story was a reminder that the world is never still, but constantly moving between many layers of reality. And the remarkable thing is that this philosophy may have originated in the earliest experiences their ancestors had in Beringia. Living among ice, fierce winds, wide lands, and low skies, people could never imagine themselves as the center of the universe. They understood that the greatest strength was not to control, but to blend, to merge with the harsh rhythm of nature, to move with the land and the wind. That spirit, passed down through thousands of years, became one of the deepest pillars of the cultures of the Americas: humility before nature, without abandoning responsibility for nature. In many communities, this responsibility was expressed through life cycle ceremonies. birth rituals, coming-of-age rites, marriage rituals, and the final farewell for those who passed on. Each ceremony did more than mark a personal milestone. It marked a person's relationship with the land. When a child was born, they were introduced to the earth through a cleansing bath by placing a symbolic object near the base of a tree or by sprinkling a small handful of soil onto the child's feet. And when someone died, they did not leave the world. They returned to the earth. A phrase not meant to sound mystical, but deeply respectful of nature's cycle. Some communities tied this responsibility to the story of the ancestors. They believed their ancestors did not simply live in memory. They lived in the river, in the stones, in the wind. Because of that, over-harvesting the forest, hunting without restraint, or polluting a river was seen as an offense against their own lineage. These moral rules were unwritten, yet they were followed with absolute sincerity. Each person lived as if they were in constant dialogue with the past and accountable to the future. Another essential idea in many cultures was that time was not a straight line, it was a circle. Seasons followed seasons, years followed years, generations followed generations. There was no absolute beginning and no final end. This worldview created a way of living, thinking, and understanding reality that differed profoundly from linear concepts of time. If time was a circle, then every action returned, every mistake could be corrected, every difficult season would eventually give way to an easier one, every person was part of a great looping path. Seen more deeply, this circular philosophy mirrored the structure of the sky itself, the pattern of solar cycles, the rhythm of rainfall and drought, the cycle of life and death in nature. And that philosophy kept communities steady even during periods of extreme climate change. When all these elements come together, art, astronomy, ritual, the circular philosophy, the living memory, you begin to see something clearly. The Americas did not develop civilization through a pyramid of centralized power, but through a circle of connection and balance. Each community was a point on that circle, standing apart yet connected to all others. And for that reason, indigenous cultures in the Americas were never fragmented despite their overwhelming diversity. They resembled a network of interlocking circles, the circle of seasons, the circle of land, the circle of memory, the circle of culture, the circle of history. And within all those circles lies Beringia at the invisible center, not because it was the first place, but because it was the place where human beings first learned to see the world with patience, with respect, with observation, and with the quiet belief that life never stops flowing, even when the land shifts shape, even when the ice melts, even when the sea rises. As the great cultures across the Americas shaped their own spiritual, social, and ceremonial structures, something else, quiet but powerful, continued to unfold within each community. They began to look back at themselves, not through written records or chronicles, but through subtle questions about origin and meaning. Every culture on the continent had a story of how humans appeared, yet none placed themselves at an absolute beginning. All spoke instead of a journey, a rising from the earth, an emergence from darkness, a following of ancestral footsteps, or a movement toward the call of light. This reflected their worldview. They cared less about where they first appeared and more about what they had passed through. And that perspective, preserved for thousands of years, made their story one of the most beautiful mirrors of humility in human history. In many ceremonies, ancestors were invoked not by personal names, but by images: the one who walked with the wind, the one who crossed the ice, the one who followed the tracks of the animals, the one who waded through rivers, the one who carried fire into new lands. These images were not empty symbols. They were soft but persistent memories of the journey their ancestors had truly taken, the long movement from Beringia into a new continent, across melting ice, opening forests, wide grasslands, and dry deserts. Without writing, collective memory still preserved the shape of that journey through the motifs repeated in art, song, and ritual. As generations passed, these motifs became keys that unlocked the door to the distant past. A spiral line might represent the migration path, never straight, never easy, but winding, doubling back at times, pushing forward at others. A lone stone pillar rising from a prairie might symbolize the moment the ancestors first saw the ice corridor open. A coming-of-age ceremony might reenact the passage into new land, a journey that required endurance, solitude, deep observation, and the capacity to adapt. In many communities, children had to undergo a period of solitude in the forest, or the mountains, or by the ocean, an echo of the journey the ancestors once made. This period was not simply a test, it was a bridge between the individual and the shared memory. When a child completed the trial, they did not simply step into adulthood, they stepped into the lineage of their people. They became a keeper of memory, an inheritor of the path, someone who understood that the true strength of a person did not lie in weapons or possessions, but in the ability to move in harmony with the cycles of the land. Meanwhile, archaeological evidence, though buried under time, continues to recount each chapter of humanity's journey southward. Spear points, charcoal traces, footprints, and stone tools appear like fragments of a much larger story. At places such as Cooper's Ferry, Monte Verde, Paisley Caves, and White Sands, these clues seem to whisper that people did not follow a single path. They traveled along many routes, season by season, instinct by instinct, guided by food, water, and the subtle rhythms of the land. Each trace is a small story, but when pieced together they reveal an expansion from Alaska to Patagonia, so swift it seems impossible unless we understand their philosophy of living. That philosophy was simple: never arrive with the intention of staying forever. They moved with a spirit of testing, observing, and deciding. If the land was good, they stayed. If it was not, they moved on. If game was plentiful, they built camps. If the herds changed their routes, they changed theirs too. This flexibility allowed them to cross thousands of miles within just a few dozen generations, something that would sound unimaginable in the harsh world of the late Ice Age. But people did not carry only tools and memories, they carried ecosystems with them. When they entered a new region, they shifted the presence of plants and animals in subtle ways. They burned grasslands to draw in game, they opened pockets of forest to plant seeds, they scattered plant species as they traveled. These changes were not deliberate attempts to engineer the environment in the modern sense, but they were enough to reshape landscapes over time. Regions we now call pristine wilderness may once have been touched repeatedly by human hands. Vast grasslands may have been maintained through cycles of fire. These changes did not destroy nature, they tuned it. In the Amazon, archaeologists once scanned a forested area with LiDAR and uncovered countless traces of courtyards, mounds, canals, and ancient garden plots, evidence that the forest had been heavily shaped by people, yet so harmoniously that time completely hid their presence. That landscape is proof that indigenous peoples did not live apart from nature, but intertwined with it, the way breath merges into air. Beyond archaeology, modern genetics shines an equally powerful light on this story. Studies of ancient DNA reveal that the ancestors of indigenous peoples in the Americas were not a single lineage, but a tapestry woven from many groups who once lived across Siberia and Beringia. Some carried genetic signatures from peoples deep within the interior of Eurasia. Others showed markers from groups who lived along the Pacific coastline. And some carried traces of an even older population, one whose homeland remains unknown, yet whose genetic fingerprints appear in communities throughout South America. This reveals something profound. Beringia was never just a bridge. It was a genetic continent, an expanse where many human lineages met, blended, and later separated to follow their own paths. Over thousands of years living in that wide, frozen land, different ancient groups shared more than fire and food. They shared their genomes, and when they finally entered the Americas, they carried that mixture with them. That blending became the foundation that allowed the countless cultures of the Americas to grow diverse while still holding on to an invisible common root. Looking deeper into genetics, scientists discovered another remarkable detail. Some communities in South America carry traces of an ancient genetic signature related to prehistoric peoples from the Australia-Melanesia region. This does not necessarily mean that there was a direct migration from those distant islands to the Americas, but it suggests a far more complex history among the peoples living along the vast edges of Eurasia, places where ice, forests, oceans, and wind constantly shaped and reshaped human populations. These genetic echoes do not contradict the story of Beringia, they enrich it. They show that Beringia was not the sole beginning, but a great crossroads where many human threads converged over tens of thousands of years. When we understand this, we begin to grasp the full depth of ancestral stories in indigenous cultures. They did not see themselves as appearing on the continent, but as arriving upon it, not as beings created in a single place, but as people guided across many worlds. And when their first steps touched the soil of Alaska, they did not think they had found a new homeland. They simply believed they were continuing the path that land and sky allowed them to walk. This is why their philosophy never centers on possession, but on movement, not on boundaries, but on roots, not on the present, but on the cycle. And it is this worldview that gave them extraordinary resilience through the long rhythms of climate, environment, and history. When we place all the archaeological, genetic, and cultural evidence side by side, one truth becomes unmistakable. The story of the Americas is the story of the deepest movement in human history. Quiet, unrecorded, but carved into every piece of land, every shift of season, every migration route of animals, every pattern on pottery, every cedar pole along the coast, and every memory carried through firelit stories at night. All of it leads us to a gentle but powerful realization. The destination was never as important as the journey itself. And in all of human history, few journeys were as long or as quiet as the one taken by the ancestors who walked from Beringia into the Americas, an epic whose footprints were erased by melting ice and rising seas, yet whose memory remains alive, spreading through every culture like wind moving across the grasslands. As the Great Migration stretched across thousands of years, slowly slipped into the distant past, and as the cultures of the Americas blossomed into countless forms, something else, subtle and quiet, began to emerge. It was the realization that even though each community had become its own world, they all carried a single, delicate thread leading back to that faraway age in Beringia. This thread was not scientific knowledge, nor material evidence, nor even genetic memory. It was a survival spirit, the spirit of patience, of observing nature as if observing the self, of enduring isolation without losing the bond of community, of living by cycles rather than by absolute declarations. Today, when archaeologists and geneticists press their hands into ancient soil, they are decoding what indigenous communities once knew by intuition. The past does not vanish, it only changes its shape. A stone with a carved edge, a fleck of charcoal buried in lake sediment, a spear point still bearing traces of animal flesh, a strand of ancient DNA pulled from bone, preserved in deep ice, all of them are pieces of a vast tapestry woven by ancestors over tens of thousands of years. And when those pieces are placed side by side, we begin to see a story wider than every border, older than every era, deeper than any idea of origin that humanity has ever drawn. That story did not begin with a single day or a single moment. It began with long winters, short summers, the advance and retreat of glaciers, the opening and closing of land as sea levels shifted. Humans did not choose the timing, they followed the pathways that nature revealed. And that rhythm is what made this migration one of the longest chapters in human history, not for its numbers or speed, but for the way it unfolded, quietly, slowly, and without pause. During those thousands of years, people did not imagine they were creating history. They were simply trying to survive. Yet history is often made by those who never realize they are writing it. The fires they kindled beside glacial rivers, the spear points they sharpened before a hunt, the skin bags they packed as they followed seasonal routes, the children born and raised in that cold, expanding world. Each small action, gathered across time, became the movement of people across a continent they could not yet imagine. And the strange, beautiful truth is this: when we look back from the present, the journey resembles a slow-moving glacier. No one saw it shift from one moment to the next, but across generations it crossed an entire hemisphere. No single person stood long enough to witness the ice change its edge, yet as life passed from one generation to the next, the world quietly transformed. And as people settled across the Americas, they continued extending the branches of that great river of movement through new cultures, each one reflecting a different way of understanding land, sky, and time. Those who lived near the Arctic coast read the wind as if reading an old book. Those on the plains read the paths of bison as if reading a calendar. Those in the forests read the hum of insects as signals of the seasons. Those who lived by the sea read the tides as if they were messages whispered by their ancestors. Everyone read the world in their own way, but they all read it to survive, to understand, and to move in harmony with the rhythms of nature. When the great civilizations of Central America and the Andes eventually rose, they did not emerge from isolation, but from the accumulation of tens of thousands of years of observing, experimenting, remembering, balancing, and adapting. Their stone pyramids were not built merely out of the will to command, but because people wanted to mirror the mountains, the very shapes that connected sky and earth. Their vast plazas were not constructed for spectacle, but to read the shadow of the sun. Their long, straight lines drawn across the desert were not signs of mysterious powers, but immense diagrams recording the cycles of seasons and water. Even the places we now call ancient cities were, in truth, ceremonial centers, places where people gathered in certain seasons, not to live densely, but to align themselves spiritually. These civilizations were not the product of intelligence alone. They were the product of collective memory, stretching back to the time when ancestors still stood on the cold ground of Beringia, learning that life is a cycle and that the cycle must be honored. Elsewhere, smaller communities never became empires, yet they developed their own refined ways of understanding the world, no less profound than any culture in Africa, Asia, or Europe of the same era. What set them apart was their focus on balance between humans and land, between past and present, between individual and community. People today often romanticize this mindset, but in truth it was forged by countless seasons of hardship. When the land became harsh, only communities that held on to harmony endured. And above all, we see that although each landscape produced a distinct culture, all of these cultures reflected the same core truth, one that, if we look closely, is the very first lesson their ancestors learned in Beringia. Humans cannot move against nature. They can only move with it. When the ice retreated, they moved. When the ice advanced, they paused. When the sea pushed inland, they changed paths. When the earth cracked, they shifted their seasons. When the winds changed direction, they changed the rhythm of the hunt. There was never a battle to defeat nature, only subtle adjustments that allowed them to exist alongside it. When we understand this, we finally grasp the true strength of the journey, not a strength born of muscle or weapons, but a strength of patience, of observation, of quiet resilience. And it is precisely that softness, like meltwater slipping through stone, that carried humanity across distances no other species has ever crossed. Today, when we stand before the Bering Sea and look toward its cold horizon, we no longer see the ancient land. But if we listen long enough, we can sense a faint sound, a thin thread of memory, not the memory of individuals, but of our entire species. It whispers that beneath those waters once lay a vast world where the first people learned to read the wind, the ice, the dim light of winter. A world where generations overwintered together, holding a silence so long it became instinct. A world where they waited, not in despair, not in haste, until the path finally opened. And when the path opened, they walked, not like an expedition, but like a breath, steady, patient, gentle, yet unyielding. They carried few possessions, but they carried the one thing that mattered most, the ability to live with the land. That ability followed them into the new continent, through forests, mountains, deserts, plains, and great rivers, through climates they had never imagined. It followed them into every culture that would later rise, from small villages to great ceremonial centers. And when we look back at the entire journey, we realize that the miracle is not in how far they went, but in how they went. Strong yet soft, persistent yet subtle, filled with fear yet equally filled with hope. It was a journey that lasted thousands of generations, with no leader at the front, no scribe recording events, no command shaping the movement. Yet each generation knew how to continue the rhythm like seeds, carrying the memory of seasons. In the end, the story of Beringia is not the story of a physical bridge, but a spiritual one, a bridge connecting humanity to its deepest ability, the ability to change in order to survive, while still remaining gentle with the world. It reminds us that even if seas rise, ice melts, and land shifts its shape, the things that matter most in the human journey never disappear. And perhaps as we close this long path, we do not need a grand statement or an absolute truth, only a quiet breath that all of us, wherever we live today, carry within us a trace of the footsteps that once crossed that land now hidden under the sea. We are the continuation of that patience, that silence, that endurance, a long memory drifting through ice, through wind, through water, a memory called Beringia.